I got to see a side of my dad that nobody else ever saw. Football was our time. I remember sitting on his shoulders as he carried me along Floyd Road to see the Addicts at the Valley for the very first time. It was against Arsenal, the team he called the Woolwich Rejects. If I close my eyes, I'm there again, buried at the bottom of that hill of caps and raincoats, which was the East Terrace at the Valley. I could feel him gently lifting me with those huge bucket hands of his and then gliding over a sea of friendly faces to sit on the track at the front. However, it's the memories I have of Dad himself that I hold most dear. I was the only one in my family who saw his face light up when we scored, and I was the only one who ever saw my dad cry when Sam Bartram played his last game for Charlton. Now Dad's gone, a picture of his face sometimes springs into my mind. Wonderfully, it catches me unawares. When that happens, I can see him bathed in the Wembley sunshine, still in his greasy overalls from his shift at Vickers. Weariness stripped from him in the sheer joy that comes with football. Young again. We're together once more, with Sam Bartram guarding the Charlton goal, and I'm happy. Wonderful memories. But they do make me sad sometimes. I miss him. Now I'm standing in his front room, waiting to go and see Charlton v Sunderland in the playoff final. It's a room full of memories, some happy, some sad. It's so quiet without him. Just the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the fireplace keeps me company. His chair might be empty, but I can feel his presence everywhere. I hope that when I'm at Wembley, if I close my eyes, I'll be able to see him again. That first match, we got the 696 trolley bus from where we lived in Crayford to Woolwich and walked the rest of the way to the Valley. They don't have trolley buses anymore, but then a lot has changed since those days. When I saw my first game, the most a player like Sam Bartram could earn was £8 a week. That wasn't much more than what Dad earned, so the players lived amongst us fans and travelled to the games like we did on the bus. Their lives outside match days were not very different from ours. When I look back to the day Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, came to the Valley in 1938, and the fans and players joined together to pray for peace in our time, it reminds me how close we all seemed back then. Why was Chamberlain at the Valley? Well, in the early hours of the 30th September 1938, the leaders of the most powerful European states, Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain, Edouard Daladier and Benito Mussolini, signed the Munich Agreement. This gave Hitler the Sudetenland, a part of Czechoslovakia which he believed was rightly part of Germany. It seems incredible that Chamberlain would choose to support his hometown team, Birmingham City, at the Valley just hours after this meeting. However, it seems likely that his much publicised appearance was a carefully planned event organised to calm fears of war and reinforce Chamberlain's message that the Munich Agreement had given Britain peace in our time. How could people doubt his claims if he could spend the afternoon watching a match? The world before the war seems a different place. A sepia-tone world of Brill cream and cigarette cards. We didn't have wags and footballers didn't worry about their hair. Well, Charlton captain Don Welsh certainly didn't. He didn't have any. Then again, Don had more than enough to worry about back then. He'd seen a future in Berlin in his England kit, and it didn't seem too promising. England beat Germany 6-3 in a friendly at the Olympic Stadium in Berlin on the 14th of May 1938 in front of a crowd of 110,000 people. Before kick-off, the English players, including Charlton captain Don Welsh, who was making his debut, were ordered by the Foreign Office to line up and perform a Nazi salute as the German national anthem was played and Nazi leaders watched. The friendly game effectively helped clear the way for Chamberlain's peace in our time deal with Hitler, which in turn led to Germany's invasion of Czechoslovakia. The one man who refused to give the salute, Stan Cullis, was quietly dropped from the team. Dad had seen it too in his oil-smeared overalls. He'd worked at Vickers, Crayford, since he'd left school. That's how he seemed to know the war was coming. Chamberlain might have been talking about peace in our time, but Vickers was so busy making guns it could only mean one thing in his opinion. Dad was a Charlton encyclopedia, and I was a willing learner. He told me all about how manager Jimmy Seed had taken the Addicts from the 3rd Division to the 1st Division runners-up in successive seasons. However, looking back now, one figure stands out like a giant over my childhood. A flame-haired colossus of a man in knee-length shorts, stripy socks and a woolly green sweater. My hero, Dad's hero, Sam Bartram. In those days, what we knew about film stars and footballers could be summed up on the back of a cigarette card. However, that's not to say that they belong to the same species. Film stars were part of a Saturday morning fantasy world. Sam and his Charlton teammates were part of the real world that filled a Saturday afternoon. Today, a Beckham can live in both these worlds, but back then, I remember how strange it seemed to see Sam filling the cinema screen of the Regal in Bexley Heath when he appeared in a newsreel about England's 1939 tour of South Africa. War, before it came, seemed part of that fantasy world too. I could look like Mickey Mouse in my gas mask and imagine our Anderson shelter was the cabin of a pirate ship. I took none of it seriously until I started mentioning the evacuation at Crayford CE Junior School. Luckily, Dad wasn't having any of that. Nobody was going to split up his family. Hitler might have invaded Poland, but my dad made his point by taking me to the Valley to see Charlton play Manchester United. The months that followed were called the Phony War. Dad said that if they were still playing football at the Valley, then things couldn't be that bad. The crowds were tiny though, and Charlton were often hopeless, although it was hard to be too critical when most of the team were up all night as air raid wardens on blackout duty. Early in 1940, when Sam Bartram was called up by the RAF, Dad persuaded me to let the scrap metal men take my old pedal car by telling me it would be melted down to make Sam a Spitfire. I didn't realise he was having me on till I found out Sam was a PE instructor and had even been picked to play for England at Wembley. Looking back, that time was like a fantasy bubble, and Hitler's Luftwaffe were about to pop it. I'll never forget the first day of the Blitz, 7th September 1940. Hitler decided to bomb the Woolwich Arsenal, and Dad and I were practically next door at the Valley. The Addicts were 4-2 down against local rivals Millwall when the sirens started. From where we stood, high up on the Great East Terrace, we could see that the barrage balloons had been raised in a vain attempt to stop the waves of German bombers that were now flying along the river towards us. Soon the anti-aircraft guns started up, and the first bombs started to fall. Large columns of soot-black smoke could be seen rising from the direction of the Woolwich Arsenal. Dad held me tightly against him as a far deadlier match than the one against Millwall took place above us. Planes twisted and turned in the air, engines screaming, as bombs exploded all around. The sky seemed to be bouncing above me as Dad carried me away from the ground to the public shelter behind Charlton House. A week later, on 15th September 1940, the Blitz came much closer to home. It was Sunday lunchtime, and we were at my nan's house in Barnhurst. That afternoon, the air was filled with the deep throbbing of engines as the blue sky was filled with the contrails of German bombers. Dad and I stood entranced as the Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged the enemy planes in a deadly dance of death. First we heard of the Dornier bomber was a low drone coming in across the rooftops to the back of us. It was so low we could see the faces of the pilot and the nose gunner at the front of the plane. It was obviously in trouble and hoping to crash land, but before it had a chance to do so, a Hurricane dived down upon it and with a burst of machine gun fire sent it crashing to the ground. We cheered as the Hurricane executed a dashing victory roll above us before disappearing over the horizon. The Dornier drew us to it like moths to a flame. Dad and I arrived to find a policeman already trying to warn off an army of souvenir hunters. He had his work cut out. What happened next is still a bit of a blur. I know Dad flung himself at me as if he was Sam Bartram, but after that, I can't remember a thing. I found out later that one of the plane's bombs exploded, killing several people, including the policeman. Dad and I spent a few days in Westhill Hospital in Dartford, which itself had been bombed just the week before. I'd suffered concussion from the blast of the bomb, but if it wasn't for Dad pushing me to the ground, I wouldn't be here. You could say that Bartram had made the best save of his life. About a month later, Dad received his call-up papers. Luckily, he was posted to the Royal Artillery and conveniently ended up at the anti-aircraft guns on Dartford Heath that were defending Vickers. I'd often sat in the entrance to our shelter to watch the searchlights trace their careful webs across the night sky. Now, I knew that when they locked upon the silvery silhouette of an enemy plane and the guns opened fire, I could sleep soundly knowing that Dad, as always, would be protecting me. About this time, you would see Italian prisoners of war wearing their distinctive overalls covered with patches, repairing damage to homes around the town. Sometimes they would ask if they could join Dad and me when we had a kickabout. Afterwards we used to chat to one of them about our trips to the valley, and he would tell us about how he would take his own son to games back home. It made me sad to think that some boy, just like me, had been separated from his dad. It made me wonder how I would cope if Dad was sent far away. I soon found out, as in 1942, Dad was posted to Norfolk. That was the first time that I'd ever really been apart from Dad. I wrote to him, of course, but it was hard not being able to talk to him. What really brought it home to me was not being with him at Wembley when Charlton got there for the very first time in the 1943 War South Cup final. Maybe it was lucky, as we lost 7-1 to Arsenal. Dad always reckoned that we lost to the Woolwich Rejects because Sam wasn't in goal for us. It hit me more not being there the following year when we actually won it. I had to make do with the commentary on the wireless as Charlton, with Sam back in goal, beat Chelsea 3-1. A couple of months later, I heard that the very same General Eisenhower, who presented Don Welsh with the cup that day, had been the mastermind of what they were calling D-Day. People were saying that the war was all over bar the shouting. But a few days later, they were all eating their words. Oh, here's the thing. Back then, AN Other was often seen in the match programme at football matches. The clubs were often forced into making an appeal to spectators for any professionals present to help fill in at the last moment if they didn't have enough players. One enterprising fan at the Valley made the most of this to join his heroes on the pitch. When Charlton's regular guest player Fred Scott was unavailable for their home game with Chelsea on the 2nd of October 1943, Charlton fielded a player called J. Rogers in a 1-0 defeat. Rogers had posed as a well-known player, but the crowd soon recognised him as a fraud and barracked him for the rest of the match. In the following match programme, Charlton manager Jimmy Seed admitted he'd been hoodwinked by Rogers' claims that he'd once played for Arsenal, Newcastle United and Chester. He apologised to fans for his inept display that was sure evidence of his inability to play football. The mysterious J. Rogers was never seen nor heard of again. At the time, we didn't have names for them, but a few weeks later, everyone was talking about them, the Doodle Bugs. You had to listen very carefully to the sound of their engines. They made a terrible racket, but at least when you heard this, you knew you were safe. The danger came when the engines stopped. In that terrible moment of silence, you knew you had a matter of seconds to find shelter before the inevitable explosion came. In Crayford, we came to rely on a couple of local lads who were blowing an old bugle to warn us when to take shelter. At school we used to mimic this in a new game we played. We would run around the playground, arms outstretched sideways, making weird noises, before suddenly falling silent and diving in front of an unsuspecting classmate, shouting, "Bang!" The reality was more serious, and when a doodlebug killed 56 people outside the post office in Crayford, Dad decided it was time for me to leave what they were calling Bomb Alley and join him in Norfolk. Dad found me a place to stay in Norfolk with a family he knew who lived at Hall Farm, Hethel. It lay right alongside the United States Army Air Force Base, near to where Dad was based with his anti-aircraft guns. There had been Yanks back home at Hall Place in Bexley, but not this many. I was staying so close to the airfield, I could count the Liberator bombers taking off, and count them back in when they returned. Some never did, and many were often shot to pieces. These planes would sometimes shoot out coloured red flares to signal they had wounded aboard. If you went into the nearby town of Wymondham, you could always see groups of Yanks from the airfield outside the Green Dragon pub. I used to say, "You got any gum, chum?" And they'd give me chewing gum or sweets that they called candy. I soon found out from them that Jimmy Stewart, the famous Hollywood actor, was a pilot at nearby Tibbenham Airfield. Well, fancy that. I found it hard to settle when I started at school. I always felt an outsider when they laughed at my accent. It was football that in the end helped to begin to break the ice. At first it was just swapping cigarette cards, and then I'd nod to some of the lads at the train station when I sometimes went to see Norwich City play at Carrow Road. I still stuck out though. the only kid wearing a red and white scarf on the train. Dad would tell me that you should never be ashamed of where you came from or how you spoke. It took another visit to Carrow Road to show me he was right. This wasn't for football, but for the United States Army Air Force Rodeo. At school, my classmates were mad about meeting Jimmy Stewart. I was too, and I dreamed of being whisked off to Hollywood. Sadly, all of our cowboy accents were dreadful, so I suppose it was lucky that none of us ever got to meet him. It didn't matter though. We all learned to laugh at each other's accents, and as a result, I finally felt accepted as one of the gang. When Hitler started his V-2 rocket attacks towards the end of 1944, I knew Dad was glad that I was no longer living in Bomb Alley. That's not to say it was entirely safe in Norfolk. One day in November 1944, I was walking towards the farm when a huge explosion blew me off my feet. Looking across the fields, I saw this huge column of smoke, and later discovered that two Liberators had collided in mid-air over Hethel, killing both the crews. The farm where I was staying employed lots of land army girls. They would go to dances at the local airfields where the Yanks would teach them how to dance the jitterbug. One night I even tagged along to see the legendary Glenn Miller play at nearby Attlebridge Airfield. One of the girls at Hall Farm even became a GI bride. Everybody pulled their ration coupons for her wedding, and the party that followed was a sign of things to come. When victory finally came, I was back home in Crayford. To celebrate VE Day, 8th of May 1945, we built a huge bonfire to burn an effigy of Hitler on one of the local bomb sites. However, the street party that followed was a little flat for me, as Dad had still not been demobbed from the army. Charlton, meanwhile, were having a great run in the FA Cup, and when they won the semi-finals to reach the first post-war FA Cup final, Dad wrote and promised me we would go. The final was against Derby County on the 27th of April 1946, and Dad knew he had to get tickets. Charlton's allocation had long sold out, and the black market prices from the taps were beyond him. He'd almost given up hope when he noticed that the local paper was running a competition to win a pair of tickets for the final. They were asking for Charlton fans to draw caricatures of the Charlton Cup final squad. Dad didn't tell me he'd entered and won until the Cup final day itself. The day of the final arrived, a glorious sunny day, but not for me. Charlton were in the Cup final, but once again I wouldn't be going, or at least I thought I wasn't. At least Dad was home now and back working at Vickers. He'd just been demobbed and said we'd go anyway, just to soak up the Wembley atmosphere. When we got there and he produced the tickets, well, I could have died and gone to heaven. We had fantastic seats, right by the newsreel cameramen on the halfway line, quite close to the royal box where the King, Queen and Princess Elizabeth were sitting. Derby scored first, or should I say Bert Turner did for them with an own goal. Then he made up for it by going up the other end and equalising for the Addicts. It was quite a strange game with the ball bursting before the game went into extra time. Sadly, Charlton was stuffed 4-1, but somehow it didn't seem to matter. That ball bursting marked the real end of the war for me. It burst just before the final whistle, and that's when I caught sight of Dad, bathed in the bright Wembley sunshine, still in his greasy Vickers overalls, but smiling as I'd never seen him smile before. I'll never forget the trip back from the FA Cup final. Dad and I never stopped talking. Charlton may have lost, but we were together again, and I realised that there were more important things in life than football. Sharing that day at Wembley with Dad made me realise how lucky I was. Not every family had made it through the war unscathed. There's nothing more important than family, he told me, and I guess he was right. The Addicts will be back next year, and this time they'll win, Dad predicted. And you know what? He was right about that too. Returning to Wembley had been hard. I wanted to go, and I wanted to leave from Dad's house, just like we always did when we went to football together. He'd have loved this game. 4-4 after extra time and then penalties. Now the stadium scoreboard read Charlton Athletic 7, Sunderland 6. Nobody had missed a penalty yet. Somebody soon was going to be a hero or villain. Such is the narrow dividing line between success and failure in a penalty shootout. Would it be Sunderland's Michael Gray, who was now taking the long walk to the penalty spot, or Charlton's goalkeeper, Sasha Illich, that would take the role of hero? I desperately wanted it to be Illich, but thought how much more confident I would be if it was Sam Bartram between those posts. I'm not sure if I'd have watched in any case, but it was then that the sun's rays broke between the twin towers, and I blinked. And in that fraction of a second, Dad's smiling face flashed through my mind's eye. In that same blinking of an eye, Michael Gray struck the ball, so with my eyes closed, I never saw Illich save it. I heard him save it. The crowd around me just went crazy. An eruption of noise told me that Illich had saved it and taken the Addicts into the Premier League. Then again, I'm not sure it was him who'd saved it. I'd like to think that Dad had asked Sam to give our keeper a helping hand. But somewhere, up there, Dad had sorted it for me, looking out for me as he always did. Some years have passed since that playoff game now. I'm glad that a few years later, in their centenary year, Charlton decided to build a statue of Sam Bartram outside the valley. Not that I needed one to be built for him to be my hero. I realise now that your heroes never die. They live on in your memory, making them immortal. I take comfort from that because Dad will always be my greatest hero of all.